Welcome back to Plain Living Homestead. Thank you for joining us today for a beginner sewing class. Today we're going to have an easy lesson where we learn how to pin our pattern pieces together to sew. You can use these glass head sewing pins or you can use quilting clips. Either way, I'm going to show you how to line your pieces up and how to use these properly. Let's take a look at how to pin your fabric together when you're ready to sew two pieces. The first thing is your pins and your clips. So you can use some of these sewing straight pins with these glass ball heads on them. Sometimes you can find them that have fun shapes like a butterfly or a heart here on the end. I prefer the longer ones. Usually they're referred to as quilting pins. They make some that are about half this size. I just like the longer ones because they're easier to use. There are also quilting clips. These are a great option for certain projects, and I'm going to tell you when I use each one because I use them for different reasons. Okay, these are just some little scrap pieces of fabric. We're going to pretend like these are two pattern pieces that need to be sewn together. And a lot of times when you're sewing two pieces together, you may only sew down one or two sides. So the first thing is we want to line these edges up as closely as possible. And I like to pin most of the time with my fabric on the table so that gravity is holding these pieces together and they're not all slipping around. So there's a couple ways that you can pin when you need to sew a seam. So for this, let's imagine that we need to sew a seam down this straight edge so that we can open that up and have the two pieces butted up against each other. So the first way that you can pin this is simply to stick a pin through the center of both pieces and have them held in place. You'll take this to the machine and just sew your seam. I would say this is something that more advanced sewists can do. As a beginner, I don't recommend this because this can still move and twist and get torqued around the pin. So you have to be very careful with that. Another technique that you'll see people use and that you can use is to pin directly on the seam line exactly where you want to sew. All right, so let's say we have a 1/4 inch imaginary seam line going down this edge. We will want to imagine that 1/4 inch or even measure it and mark it. And then with our pin parallel to the edge of the fabric, we're going to insert it right where we want to sew. Now, as we put the next pin in, remember that when we go to the machine, we're going to have to slide this out as we begin to sew. And you want enough room here to slide this out without stabbing yourself with the next pin. So I skip just a little bit of space so that I don't stab myself. And then I'm going to follow that imaginary seam line and insert my pin straight on the seam line. Now, you don't have to push this pin all the way in, and you don't have to grab a very big chunk of fabric here for this to hold in place. For this one, I'm not going to have enough room to put a third one in. As a beginner, you could certainly pin as much as you want to keep everything secure. Another way to pin, and the way that I prefer to pin because I think that it's more efficient and easier to sew, is to pin perpendicular to your seam line. So I like to start close to the edge up here, and I just grab a small chunk of fabric there, and I like to leave the head of my pin sticking off the edge. That way when I go to sew, as this is feeding into the machine, I can just slip this out. You see how easily that came out? And that way I can use my left hand to guide the fabric and my right hand to pull out the pins, and I almost don't even have to stop or slow down. So I'm going to start here at the beginning, and I'm going to go down. Now, I would say every 3 to 4 inches I would like a pin. There are some places where you might like more pins than that. If you've got gathers, if you've got an odd shape where you really want to make sure that it's lined up. And I like to pin fairly close to the beginning and end of my stitch line as well, just so that I know that the ends of the fabric aren't shifting on me. And again, as I feed this into the machine, it's very simple and efficient to just slide these pins out as I go and know that the fabric is going to stay aligned. Now, a place where I like to use clips is that when I have a lot of fabrics or when I'm using something bulky, like multiple layers of fabric and some sort of batting on the inside. So for example, if I were going to make this into a square that were going to be flipped right side out, I would put my batting down, and then I would put this piece of fabric right side up, and then I would put this piece of fabric right side down, carefully lining up all of the sides. Now, I could pin this. I could put a straight pin in this, but it's a little bit trickier because there's so many layers, and it gets a little bit wonky because the pin has to bring more fabric up above it to be able to slide through all of those layers. And you'll see that here on the back it creates a pucker. So instead what I would do is carefully line up all of these edges, and I would take one of my quilting clips, and I'm just going to clip it right over the edge, and it's going to hold all of these thick layers in place without actually having to go through it or create any puckers. Everything will lay flat, everything will stay lined up. And then these are very simple to remove as well. As you're sewing, you can just gently push and slide that off the side. And there you have it. That is how you pin or clip your pattern pieces together to prepare to sew.